I would like to note that we recognize that Butler University exists on the traditional territories of several indigenous groups. We honor the indigenous communities native to this land and acknowledge the debt we owe to their past, present knowledge of conflict transformation, sustainable peace, and restorative justice practices. We also understand that acknowledgement by itself is a small gesture. It becomes meaningful when coupled with authentic relationships and informed action. We are committed to developing relationships with Indigenous individuals and communities locally and globally, and to offering events on decolonization and Indigenous rights, knowledge, and movements. So you're here tonight to see a talk by Roberto Lovato, and he is a journalist and teacher. Roberto Lovato is the author of Unforgetting, a memoir picked up by the New York Times as an editor's choice that the paper also held as groundbreaking. Award-winning author Lovato is also the recipient of a reporting grant from the Pulitzer Center. His essays and reports from around the world have appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, Guernica Magazine, the Boston Globe, Foreign Policy Magazine, The Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, Der Spiegel, La Opinión, and other national and international publications. He works out of the Writers Grotto in San Francisco, his birthplace. This talk today will actually be guided by Dr. Slaus, a professor of Latin American history in the Department of History and Anthropology and affiliate faculty in race, gender, and sexuality studies and international studies. She's also the current director of global and historical studies at Butler University. And I am Christopher Pius. I'm a senior here at Butler. My major is in individualized, it's social theory, social justice theory and practice. And I am also the coordinator for HT94 events here at campus. I am posting the link to the HT94 information and also Roberto Lovato's website. If you would like to keep track of more of these events, speaker series, and workshops, so let me know. And you can click that link to see all the upcoming events and sign up to our mailing list and also to our Microsoft Teams. Dr. Slaus?
Thanks so much, Christopher. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I know that we're entering a busy time of the semester, and I appreciate that you are wanting to be here with us and learn more about Unforgetting. Christopher has already introduced our guest speaker, Roberto Lovato. I came upon his book when it was first published, I think last year. It's a very remarkable book, and we are very honored to have him with us. The way that this is going to work is that Mr. Lovato is going to introduce, especially for some of you who have not read his book yet, which I hope you will, some of the issues that are most prominent in the book and which have to do with a mixture of reporting, history, and personal memory and memoir. And this is a really amazing format in which he is able to tell a large story about his own life, and as well as his country of his family's origin, El Salvador, and what's happened in El Salvador, and as well as issues of migration. And this, of course, ties back to our exhibit, Hostile Terrain 94. If you haven't checked it out yet, it is going up in the library. We have more events, and Christopher sent put the link in the chat for you to check out. Again, we really like to have feedback, and we like for you to be there. So if you have any questions, please let us know. So now it's my honor to turn the floor over to Roberto Lovato. And what we'll do is we will take your questions, which you can put in the chat, or you can write, if you want to do them anonymously, if that is better for you, directly to Christopher. And we will just take it from there. So thank you so much for being with us, Roberto.
Thank you, Agit. Thank you, Christopher, and thanks to Butler for the honor of your attention by inviting me to join you. This is going to be a brief talk by me, and then I'm hoping we can interact, and there's some questions I'm going to be asking you along the way, and I hope you can you can join me and make this more fun and interesting by responding to some of my dumb questions. Yeah, so let me go right to it because I have a bit of terrain to cover. So Christopher, if you could.
Yep, let's get it started.
Christopher has all the power here right now, as you can see.
Hey, can you guys see the shared screen? Perfect.
So, yeah, this is my book. One of the ways to look at my book, Unforgetting, is it's what's called a reported memoir, which means that I did my work as a journalist, and I also used some of my own family story, because there's things in my family story and my own personal story that I think bring home the history I'm trying to get at, and the present. Like, I wrote the book because I was frustrated when I was looking at the news and only seeing these two-dimensional images of pain and sound bites of suffering of Central Americans that are immigration reporting, when there's a far deeper story that begins in El Salvador, but also in the US history and the history of US policy, both in El Salvador and Central America, and in cities like Los Angeles, where US-style policing has created actually the gangs in many ways and escalated their violence for sure and criminalized, etc. So, yeah, so my talk today is about the urgency of intimate memory in times of epic crisis. I think if we're going to go forward, and we have to go forward, we have no choice because we live in time, we have to face epic crisis. And so we have to prepare ourselves for that. Maybe it's a good idea to look back, which is what I've done. I've survived and witnessed war, genocide, mass graves, gang violence, narco violence, and other epic things that make up like epic levels of crisis. So next, please. So this is my effort to excavate intimate memory in times of epic crisis. Next. So here you have some of the elements of my story. My story is an underworld journey, you could say. It's actually several underworld journeys. And in the course of writing my book, I realized that I'm a creature of the underworld myself, not just because I loved mythology and as a kid and went to the library a lot, but as an adult, I started, realizing that I belong to different underworlds, beginning to the household I inhabited with that guy right there in the bottom left, my father, Roberto Lovato, who was, in addition to being a loving father and poetic sensibility, he was also kind of a kingpin of a transnational contraband network that he built on top of a network that my grandmother actually was the first to start here in San Francisco's Mission District. And you have their Hunt's Donuts on the lower left angle, where he conducted business that he would then, send goods, sometimes up to 19 boxes, to El Salvador, including, clothes, electrodomestics, perfume, bras, calculators. And then he started, jewelry, and then he got into running guns to El Salvador. Now, he wasn't running guns to the war effort. He was just selling guns to people that would buy them for a high price in El Salvador. So that's one underworld in my family. And then there's a whole underworld of family history. I grew up in a house where we had all kinds of pictures of my father, of my mother's family, and only one picture of my dad's family, my mamate, my grandmother. So then you have my journey, as an activist. And then, I worked with refugees in the countryside. And I started seeing some things that I hope none of you ever have to see, which is war, which is bombing, which is death squads, which is strafing from helicopters. And so I saw enough violence to persuade me that my work with displaced and refugee populations in El Salvador was not enough. And so I decided to go to El Salvador and join the FMLN guerrillas as a guerrillero, as an urban commando. And so there on the lower right, you have my fake ID that I got as an urban commando. And the woman there in the picture is was one of our founders and commanders, Melida Anaya Montes. So then above that, up there on the top, you have me as a journalist visiting the underworld of MS-13 gangs, meeting with the top leadership, meeting with low-level gang members, and trying to understand what turns a kid into a killer. And so then you have bones of some of the victims of the gang violence. And then there at the bottom, you have the underworld of the mass graves that I visited. And then there in Pima, Arizona, in the top left, you have the victims of the US war on immigrants that has pushed children and mothers and some fathers to horrific deaths in the desert that I visited. So I've seen them in the morgues, I've seen them in the medical examiner freezers, and I've seen them in the mass grave sites. Next, please. So now we're gonna have a video that introduces my book so that makes my life easier.
Give me one moment while I do the share audio.
All right. Yeah, so the title of the book comes from this Greek concept of aletheia, which means truth and also means unforgetting, because of the river Lethe, which is where the dead had to go, is the river of forgetting. So before you died in the Greek world, you had to go into the river of forgetting to forget who you were in life. And I think that's an apt metaphor for what governments ask us to do as citizens of these countries that have no memory.
All right, I am ready.
All right, let's hit it.
Let me know if you guys don't hear that, okay?
Oh, can't hear it.
My apologies. Dr. Slaus, can you make me host, please? Thank you.
Bear with us here. We'll be with you in a moment.
Still nothing?
Mm-mm.
All right, I think I got it.
All right. Hi, my name is Roberto Lovato, journalist and author of Unforgetting, a reported memoir excavating the real American dirt beneath headlines about MS-13, caged Central American children, and the humanitarian crisis of immigration. Headlines in which the voices of Central Americans in the United States have been silenced and forgotten. Unforgetting is also about an underworld journey, my journey across the cities, forests, and deserts of the 2,500-mile chain of forgotten, dead, and devalued life that begins in El Salvador, where I visit mass graves, morgues, and hideouts where gangs and governments have killed, dismembered, and disappeared their victims for decades. Along the way, I encountered gang leaders, death squad operatives, and guerrilleras who reveal their sometimes startling truths. Unforgetting also chronicles my inward journey to find the stories of revolutionary hope, poetic imagination, and the tenderness that survives the terror. Unforgetting also leads me to Los Angeles, the birthplace of the gangs that would later be exploited for political gain. Eventually, I returned to my birthplace, San Francisco's Mission District, to the stories of my immigrant family, including those of my father Ramon, who bore the astonishing secret that would alter my life. I'd like to invite you on this journey towards forgotten love and healing that we must all take if we are to face the crises of our time. Please join me in the adventure of Unforgetting. Thank you, Christopher. Now we can move back to the slide. Can we bring it back to the, oh, there we go. So, okay, so there are my folks. There's my first look, my first car, an old Merc that we turned into a lowrider back in the day here in 24th and Mission. There's me as a kid, and there's Carlos Santana, who my brother went to school with. So that, I had to emphasize to my publisher, my editor, and to others that I'm not some tropical dude from Latin America. Man, I was born here in San Francisco and raised in a very particular moment, a magical moment, in a magical neighborhood known as the Mission, which has now been gentrified by Silicon Valley and pushing rents upward of, on average, for a one-bedroom studio for like $4,000, $3,500 to $4,000. So there's a little bit of that story in there. Next, please. All right, so here's where I'm asking you to join me. There's a contest. Next. All right, so I give a free book to anybody who can guess why I grew up with what Shakespeare called rich eyes and poor hands, even though I grew up down the street from the projects. These projects no longer exist on Folsom Street. They're now been turned into kind of like these condo-looking projects, but those are the projects I grew up playing in. So does anybody want to guess who? If you've read parts of the book, you maybe have a shot at it.
I saw Natalie Long's hand go up. Natalie, do
All
you
right,
want to
let's
say?
see.
It's because you traveled a lot.
Uh-huh.
So you saw a lot of things.
Why did I travel a lot? How did I get to travel a lot?
Your parents' jobs afforded you cheap flights and cheap accommodations.
All right, Natalie Long wins a copy of my book. Thank you, Natalie. Yes, next slide, please. I had rich eyes and poor hands because my mom was a maid with a 5-star hotel, the Hyatt Regency back then. And my dad was a janitor with United Airlines. So even though I grew up around the projects, I got to see the world by the time I was 14. So that's one of the things that kind of makes me a freak in a lot of ways. Next, please. So anybody, no book for this one. Otherwise, I'm gonna run out of books if all the students are as good as Natalie. So you wanna guess what my travels around our big, beautiful, but crisis-ridden Earth have taught me? Kent, it has something to do with this picture that was in, stuff about this place was in the news. That one's a little harder. Let's move on, please. I learned that the border is a construct, a machete of memory designed to both erase history and divide families and entire peoples, beginning with indigenous peoples, right? Because the world wasn't born with nation states. And one of the things that my book is about these artificial constructs known as nation states, or what scholars like Benedict Anderson call imagined communities. So that, really the idea of a nation has about as much reality as a unicorn and Santa Claus. So they're only real because people believe they're real. Kind of like some of these ideas about Jesus that people have. Sorry if I offend anybody, but that's how I feel, but you'll see why. And so that's actually, next please, next slide. So that satellite picture was taken from over there in Del Rio, Texas, where desperate Haitian migrants were crossing, trying to cross into the United States to seek asylum. And they were greeted by national security operatives like the Customs and Border Patrol. So if you know anything about the Border Patrol like I do, they're mostly a performance organization. They're really media smart and savvy. So what are they doing with these kinds of actions on horses when they could be in 4x4s? They don't need those stupid horses. They're doing it in order to create this imaginary of the cowboy and white supremacy that follows from that. So, and that's part of what my book is about, is dismantling these ideas of national security. Next. And I also go into the actual material effects that happen because of that machete that is the border. That machete kills and maims children and mothers and other innocents. I've seen the bones, I've smelled the bodies, I've heard the screams of mothers, of children, and it doesn't matter who's the president of the United States, whether it's Donald Trump or Barack Obama, the United States government is committed to killing Central American and other migrants by the thousands. This happened, I took this picture in the Obama era when approximately, and this is a very conservative estimate, 3,000 women and children mostly were killed in the deserts of Sonora and the southwestern US and Chihuahua. So it doesn't matter who's the president, Democrat or Republican. Biden's doing it, Trump did it. It began with Clinton when they militarized the border. Next, please. So, I guess one of the things I want to communicate is that all of us, even the most challenged and humble among us, can and must destroy the dangerous illusions in our minds. Illusions like the border. Next, please. So I feel this way because of things like this, the picture that I took. This picture is from a scene in my book where I visit a site where about a dozen children and some parents were seeking refuge in a brick house because the military was starting to bomb, and the bombs dropped on the house that the families and children were hiding in. And all those little crosses are crosses for the little children who were wiped out by those bombs. So because of things like this, I feel very strongly about the United States and its role in El Salvador and Central America. And I felt so strongly that I had to change my life because I was working with refugees as a nonprofit guy when I was doing this. And then I saw this and I said, it's not enough just to sit there and provide aid to refugees. I want to do something else. So I did, next slide, please. So then I decided to join the FMLN guerrillas. I became a guerrillero. And so there I am, skinny as hell, in a tank top in Chalatenango in 1990, when I first, joined the guerrillas. And this was very late in the war because I came to everything very late because I was doing kind of the crazy life when I was a kid. Next. So my book and my life are kind of a fire. I see them as a fire that destroys illusions of history that borders us off from the terror and the tenderness of our truths. Because if we don't look at the difficult things, we're not going to be able to look at the world in any real way, whether it's as a society, as a nation, or as individuals. When you don't look at the difficult, painful things in your family, you adopt what psychologists call a false self. So however you look at it, you don't want to be in a false self and in a false idea of nationhood. Next. And so a major reason I wrote the book was to counter the extreme erasure of Central Americans from our own lives. I did an investigation for the Columbia Journalism Review, which is, I'm told, is a very prestigious entity at Columbia University. And I looked at the coverage of the child separation story during the Trump era and a little bit in the Obama era. And what did I find? How many Central Americans did I find in the story? In CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, across the board, every major media outlet, that I looked at, volunteers and I looked at, found all of 0 Central American scholars, Central American advocates, Central American lawyers, Central American nonprofit leaders, Central American authors, Central American journalists. So Central Americans were completely erased from our own story. And that's still largely the case. You don't see us on MSNBC or on Fox, because if you have somebody like me, you're going to have to expose the fact that the Obama administration joined Trump in caging, separating, and killing Central American children. And that's just not something that's allowed to be said in national media very often. It's okay to say that Trump caged and separated and killed children and mothers, but it's not okay to say that Obama did it. And there are complex reasons for that I call intersectional empire. So I think that's about it. Next, please. So we can now kind of engage with Agit.
Thank you so much for that overview. I really appreciate it. And I think a lot of people who are not able to read the book yet really appreciate it as well. So I am brimming with questions. I have some questions to get us started, but I really also want to invite all of you that are part of this. As Christopher said, it's a community event. That's why, you're very much encouraged to ask your questions directly or put them in the chat. I can ask you to unmute yourself, or if you're more comfortable that, Christopher asked them for you, you can also email them, put them in, message him directly, as well, if that works better for you. We just want to make sure that we get a lot of participation. I also invite you, if you can, to make sure that your video is on so we can see you all and we're not just peering into the darkness here. Roberto, again, thanks. My first question is I have a number of themes that I'm working at, and the first one is political, and I really appreciate your comments about politics. So in your book, we see a direct relationship between U.S. foreign policy, efforts of destabilization in the region, in El Salvador primarily, but you also, talk about, rightfully so, the rest of Central America, and a lot of that was going on at the same time. With the Contras, for instance, and against Nicaragua and in Guatemala. And government-sanctioned violence that resulted in enormous displacement and migration, and also resulting in what I would think is like systemic trauma. So there seem to be several cycles at work here: displacement, immigration, migration, but also then again deportation once people end up in gangs, destabilization of the region, government-sanctioned violence, and gangs. So I think in some ways you've already addressed this, but what is the responsibility of the United States here?
I wrote a whole book about that, man. It's a difficult to answer question, but if you know anything about policies in Central America, Mexico, throughout the Americas, you know that from its inception, shortly after its inception with things like the Monroe Doctrine, the United States established that this was its, quote, backyard. So there's always been a paternalistic domination kind of program in place by the United States in the Americas, especially after the 19th century, when Spain was in decline as the hegemonic power in the Americas, and the United States went in and beat it up to get the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and other Guam and other possessions that it made its own, as the people of Puerto Rico will tell you, the effects of that colonial history. So in case of El Salvador, the United States and Central America generally, and Latin America, you had the Cold War, you had the Soviet Union and the communist bloc influencing the world and being a counterbalance to the capitalist order of led by the United States. And the United States would have none of that. So anybody that was perceived to be communist or accused of being communist was considered an enemy. And so the United States spent billions of dollars in the Americas to train, equip, politically protect fascist military dictatorships. I don't mean that as a joke. I mean that real fascists, not play fascists. Fascists in El Salvador who killed 85% of about 80,000 people, including in massacres like El Mozote that I visited, that I documented, that I actually some of those pictures I have in my book are pictures of the bones of people that are still being excavated from a massacre that took place in 1980. In this small town where almost 1,000 people were killed by the U.S. trained and equipped Salvadoran military and its death squads. The U.S., we just celebrated. I mean, people are just now really sad that Colin Powell died. Colin Powell supported the training and the political protection and the arming of this military at around the same time that they were perpetrating these massacres like El Mozote, where, again, 1,000 people were killed. About half of those people killed were children under 12. And then half of the children under 12 were under age 6. So that's what Colin Powell, that's what Elliott Abrams, a Republican, that's what Ronald Reagan, speaking of fascists, perpetrated in El Salvador. That's just one small example. You also have the role of the U.S. after the war in, when we defeated them in the peace, we tried to establish a new policing order. And the United States inserted the FBI, Rudy Giuliani, the Justice Department to train the Salvadoran police in US style policing. And so then the trainers that trained the Salvadoran death squads came back to the US, and guess where they went? To train LAPD, to train New York PD, SFPD, to militarize the US police forces. And so then you have what I call these circuits of counterinsurgency policing that reflect US policy, the protection of US mining interests, the US capitalist interest. If they don't get their way economically, they're going to insert the police and the military. And that's kind of what's happening now to the United States, where the division between rich and poor is surpassing that of Latin America. And so it's no surprise that in a country that's being neoliberalized, the US police would start resembling the police of Latin America and vice versa.
Yeah, that is, it's not a great thing, but it's a great observation that you make. And it's one that I try to tell students about too, that oftentimes these places that we don't hear about very much become sort of the laboratories of policies and of particular kinds of structures of power that then get implemented in the centers of power, whether it's Europe or the United States later. In the book, you describe, and I think this is really apt, you interweave, for those of you who did not read the book, Roberto goes all the way back to the 1930s and the childhood of his father, and to understand not only where his father was coming from in terms of how history and this particular history of violence affected his father, but also to tell the story of El Salvador itself. So it's he's interweaving it. And in the book, you describe going back to El Salvador, obviously many, many times, but one time, maybe a little bit most recently before the book was published in 2015 as a reporter, but also on a personal voyage in what you call Unforgetting. And one of the places you visit is a mountainous terrain outside of San Salvador that for generations, through the war and the counterinsurgency of the 70s and 80s up into today's gang violence, has been a repository for thousands of bodies, mass graves of mass murder that dot the Salvadoran landscape, as you say. And I think these killing fields, and you already made this connection, reminded me of was one of our speakers last week, anthropologist Jason de Leon's work on the US-Mexican border to detail and humanize the lives and deaths of migrants in his work, The Land of Open Graves. And when I got to the part that you described, I was thinking this is also a land of open graves. And again, what this connects to is the government policies that ultimately result in this death. And either directly what you describe, what the United States, especially the Reagan administration and beyond, did in El Salvador, but also letting the hostile terrain of the desert do the dirty work of decimating people, not only seeking better lives, but also fleeing endemic violence. And so can you say a little bit more about how you see this connection between violence and migration and displacement and what happens there?
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason I go to mass graves because El Salvador has thousands of mass graves. And by definition, a mass graves is 2 or more people in it. So there are mass graves with 2 or 3 people in them. There are mass graves with 100 people in them. There are mass graves like entire towns like El Mozote where 1,000 people were killed, which was a mass grave site. Most of them are unexcavated except for El Mozote. So so mass graves are a fact, a tragic fact of life, but they're also metaphorically speaking, I think very important in terms of being help us understand why people migrate. People migrate because of the unresolved trauma that's in a mass grave, the unresolved crime, so that most of the killers, I mean, I visited mass grave sites like Panchimalco, where on one layer you have the hundreds of people left dead by the gangs. Below them, in some places, are the thousands of people killed, the remnants of thousands of people killed by the US-backed military dictatorship. So that's, when you look at a mass grave, you're looking at a site of unresolved trauma, a site of unresolved crime, an open wound, which permits what I call impunity to continue. Impunity means that you get away with it. Mm-hmm. And so the line of criminality runs from, low-level military people to high-level military people trained in places like Fort Benning, Georgia, the School of the Americas, Fort Leavenworth, and others, to all the way to the top of the presidency of the United States. In different ways, Presidents Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, Obama, Trump, and Biden have continued a series of war and post-war anti-gang policies, or in the case of the Cold War era, anti-communist, quote unquote, policies that have led to the massification of death, the cheapening of life. So when you don't resolve the crimes, you cheapen the value of human life. So I've gone not just to El Salvador, but to Guatemala, to Mexico, all the way to little towns here in the United States, like Brooks County, where the bodies of migrant children and mothers are swept up by the authorities in these little Texas towns and in Arizona. They take the remains, they put them in plastic bags and milk cartons, and they dump them in mass graves. So I see this from a historical perspective as a chain, not just of mass graves, but a chain of failed US policy or successful US policy if you're a killer, or open wound of trauma, and a chain of devalued life stretching from Central America all the way to the US. All of these mass graves have Made in America on them, basically, in one form or another, because of US policy, with the complicity of the government of Mexico, regardless of who's president, mm-hmm. or Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, regardless of who's president. Now, that said, I just should say that my book is actually not just a downer. My book is also about the spirit of a people that overcomes this immense terror, which is why you see in the video, I mean, talking about the tenderness that survives the terror. Terror won't kill tenderness, but it will bury it in pain, so that you sometimes don't access the tenderness in you because the pain in you keeps you from accessing that. So that's all these things lead to a necessity to use memory to excavate the past, like forensic specialists excavate mass graves.
I have, thanks. I have a question about that, and I know that there may be other questions that are out there. So maybe this will be my last one for now. In your book, one of the most, the strongest arguments is the necessity to unforget, as you call it. And I really like, and I think it's also sharp and kind of jarring that you're not saying to remember, but that you deliberately say to unforget. And so I had a number of questions about unforgetting, but as a historian, you know, I am obviously interested in how the past gets constructed. I'm also interested in public memory and especially communal memory as well. But how do you see the difference as being between this unforgetting and how do we do this versus memory and remembering? Because we often hear we have to remember, we should never forget, but we are not really told to unforget. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, let me start off by reading a quote at the beginning of my book by a philosopher named Ernest Renan, who was one of the early theorists of these things that were nation states. And I quote, "Forgetting, I would even say historical error, is an essential factor in the creation of a nation. Historical inquiry, in effect, throws light on the violent acts that have taken place at the origin of every political formation, even those that have been the most benevolent in their consequences. Unity is always brutally established." So what Renan is pointing to is the essential violence that creates nations. Just ask any Native American peoples at any part of any place in this big world that we live in. You know, the erasure of indigenous people, indigenous memory, and the violence that decimated them, whether it was biological violence of disease or the slaughter of women, children, and men by the US military and other actors, the Texas Rangers, or the violence of nationhood today that, oftentimes I believe, I don't subscribe to any national identity at this point. That's part of the point of my book. I said, fuck America, basically, after I saw what America did to babies' bodies, where their skin was grafted onto the adobe huts that I visited, where I won't even go into the details because I don't want to trigger anyone, but so memory, I got the idea of unforgetting first because I used to be a right-wing born-again Christian who got on my knees to pray for Ronald Reagan in the 80s. I got out of a certain kind of gang type lifestyle that I need to get out of, and sometimes the only way you can get out is to get saved. And there's ministries that are built up on this. And so, I started studying theology and I discovered this concept of aletheia that the Greeks had, which the Christians took to mean truth along with the Greeks. So when I left the church, I'm no longer a right-wing fascist, because right now, I think a lot of evangelical churches are extensions of a fascist order that the Republican Party, Trump, and others reflect, and that's growing. I've been to these churches, I still go, and I just listen in, and you hear more politics than you do gospel sometimes. So people forgot what the Bible was actually about, in my opinion. So I went and I left the church and I became a revolutionary. Then I went back to studying, and I found this concept. I took a German philosophy class at Berkeley that included the work of a philosopher named Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt got this concept of aletheia from her former colleague and former lover, Martin Heidegger. And the way that Arendt used Unforgetting was fascinating to me, because she took this concept to describe the kind of memory work necessary to challenge fascism in the theater of memory, right? She was basically saying you have to fight fascism in the present, anticipate the future, but you have to look back at how fascism is constructed, how it came about. And so the idea of the Greeks was that, again, you go into the underworld and you either go to Hades or Elysium, and you have to forget who you are by going into the Lethe River, the river of forgetting. And so this complements nicely a concept that I discovered in El Salvador, which was memoria histórica, historical memory, which is the use of memory in the pursuit of justice. So that when you're excavating mass graves, when you're bringing former dictators to justice, when you're bringing low-level murderers to justice, those are acts of memoria histórica, and I would argue unforgetting. So unforgetting is my concept. The way I use it is a mix of Hannah Arendt, the Greeks, and memoria histórica.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask Christopher if there are any questions that were posed to you.
Yeah, we got a couple actually. And this one's actually really tied to what you were just talking about, Roberto. And it's they were wondering if can you talk about the politics of forgetting and the role of media and governments have in shaping how the public thinks about things like migration?
Oh, think about the concept I put out of the machete of memory, right? Look at the way, I can tell you as a journalist, look at the way that immigration is covered. Immigration, whether it's MSNBC or Fox, will look at it, the immigration from the border with Mexico north. They won't look at what's happening and what causes migration. They won't explain to you the history of policy. When they do, like in the Washington Post, you get these stories about, Trump's Title 42 and Trump's child separation, Trump's caging, but they won't tell you that he inherited the system that Obama created. And so there you have an example of the way that the media, the liberal media, works just like the right-wing media in terms of the act of forgetting, making us basically forget that there's actually a history in the South. There's a US policy. Why don't you know what the United States did in Central America? Because they don't want you to know. And that extends not just in the media, I would even say that in the academy at this point. You can't talk like I do and get a job in some universities, quite frankly. I'm telling you, this is the degree of desperation and decline. You're in a country that's in steep decline. And so, what used to be progressive is now kind of reactionary at this point. And it's across the board because, and it affects migrants in a very particular way, because there's a perception that there's no room, there's no resources for migrants, when the US has a responsibility, especially as the primary driver of the most colossal catastrophe of our lifetimes, climate change, right? That was basically a US style capitalism applied and practiced throughout the world that is driving migration from the southern countries to the northern countries in Asia, Europe, and in the Americas, to the tune of somewhere between 500 million to 1 billion people will be displaced. But they're not going to tell you that it's because of climate change. They're going to tell you these fantasies about immigrants seeking, like there's a story in the Washington Post yesterday about the debate, quote unquote, within the Biden administration about, how to handle immigration policy. And, you have on one side, the liberals saying, we should try to treat people a little better. and going back to the Obama era, which was a catastrophe itself. And then you have the right wing of the Biden administration, the national security arm, like Susan Rice, former ambassador, who's now a domestic policy advisor, saying that migrants are coming. We shouldn't, kind of provide COVID shots and things because migrants will be attracted to that. These are the talking points of fascist racists on Fox News. And now they're being adopted by, white Democrats, Black Democrats, Latinx Democrats, which is why I talk about intersectional empire, because empires, just because you have somebody Black at the presidency doesn't mean they're going to stop killing, bombing, destroying the world, okay, like they did under Republicans. Just because you have a trans person president, when you get to that point, that's not going to matter if the empire is in place. But you're going to see like blind, disabled, Afro-Latina, Jewish, Muslim presidents of the United States go and do the same things that these people, the issue is the empire, it's not the identity.
Thank you for that. And, to follow that up, I think Andrew Stilley's question fits pretty well. Andrew, if you want to ask it yourself.
I can go ahead and ask it. I'm just wondering how we as individuals can hold our government accountable for US actions in El Salvador and other Central American nations. Like what actions we can take as individuals.
Wow, if I had the answer to that, that's a great question, Andrew. If I had the answer, I could get the leftist Nobel Prize, whatever that is. But the first thing we need to do, I think, is educate ourselves. Understand really well what the US has done. Because then you can become a lawyer that advocates for migrants or for human rights. You can become, a member of a group like, when you see a movement like Occupy come up, you can join it and you can put that knowledge into it. You can be in solidarity with migrants right now with groups like El Otro Lado in Tijuana. You can join Haitian solidarity groups. You can, I think what I would most advise is patience and a long-term sense. Esto no va a cambiar de día a noche. This isn't going to change overnight. So plan a long-term struggle for your life. I have planned, and so far, knock on wood, I've succeeded in living a life committed to social justice at my 57 years. Okay, that's 30 years I've been active. I think you need to plan. You have a planet that's no longer sustainable, right? Climate change is the proof of that. And I've been to all those climate change meetings in Paris, Copenhagen, Cancun. I don't have any confidence that the powers are going to be able to solve it. The solutions are going to come from below, and they're going to come in the long term. So I think in an unsustainable planet, you need to plan to try to fight for a sustainable planet. And for that, you need a sustainable struggle. So you need organizations that sustain their vision and their program over the long term. But you need you yourself to be healthy, because you're being bombarded by the most sophisticated propaganda system ever devised. The lie is epic in scale, because the crisis of the United States is epic. So they're coming up with epic lies, not just in the Republican side, but on the Democratic side, because they don't want to do what really, how are we going to defeat climate change? Are we going to reform our way out of it? Are we going to liberal or progressive our way out of it? No. You have to dismantle the capitalist order that created climate change. That wasn't created by the Soviet Union. It was created by capitalism. So until we have a sustainable struggle, that we have to really prepare for a sustainable long-term struggle. And I'm confident in that. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you.
And then I have another one that says, There are some academics like Noah Chomsky who assert that the militarization of the border under the Clinton administration was part of a plan to enforce NAFTA. Do you think this is accurate?
That the military, yeah, anytime you have like economic policy, you always have to kind of look at what is the policing and military policy. In my book, I document the way that the US imposed an economic order in Central America, in El Salvador, and it backed it up with a military policy and now a policing policy. Now they're doing that to us here. There are parts of the United States like Detroit, not closer to you than to me, and parts of all around the country are starting to look like the southern hemisphere of the world. And that's very, tied to not just NAFTA, it's tied to the neoliberal dismantling of the welfare state inside the United States, not just welfare like they tell you, but the welfare state being the state that actually does things to take care of its people like Europe does in, free medical, medical aid, housing support, things that are civilized and humane and serious. The United States does none of them. The United States ranks really low in those. And it's going lower now because they're dismantling whatever that good there was. They're trying to dismantle and destroy labor, which tends to fight for better wages and things, so that when things are declining, they're going to militarize it more. That's kind of what my project is about in many ways, is to help people understand what's happening, that your country, this isn't about El Salvador, just about El Salvador. This is about the United States. So yes, good question.
I don't have any more questions submitted to me from students, but if any students want to submit the questions, feel free to raise your hand. And
I don't
Dr.
bite.
Strauss?
I know, Michael, did you want to answer? Yes. Sorry.
Yes, I would like to ask a question. Oh, I forgot. 1 second. Okay. Okay. So you mentioned kind of like more of like the world, or America is looking more and more like the global South. But if you ask people about income inequality, that they don't really even think about that. They kind of just think about, they don't think about that. So why do you think that when we imagine like that's like absolute poverty, we don't imagine what we see in America that's not too far away from wherever we may live? We always imagine it overseas in the South. Why is that? How has that stayed so true even though things in the US are getting worse?
Beautiful question. You're not seeing that because, well, you're not seeing it formally because your media, your entertainment systems, your institutions are not telling you that. Behind that is the need to sustain the ideal of the American dream, right? It's most people don't believe in it anymore, but that dream is so deeply rooted in the cultural systems of the United States that there is a belief that America's different. I mean, it never was different. If you look at it from the perspective of empire, right? The US has, arguably, if you include slow death, which means people starving to death and from hunger and poverty, the United States has killed more than any empire ever in history. If you look at physical killing, death squads, atomic bombs and whatnot, they rank pretty high and just with that. So you're not told that, we need to give reparations. People have to fight to get reparations. You're not told that what happened to indigenous people is genocide, that your nation is built up of genocide against indigenous peoples, enslavement of African peoples, colonization and murder of the peoples of the Americas and the peoples, Mexican people here where I live, because this used to be Mexico, by the way. So that if you're not told that, then you're given this Disneyland view of your country and its history. And you need to have people believing that to keep the existing order. which is why you had a middle class that helped kind of buffer between the working class and working class demands and the elite control of our economy. So now the middle class is challenged, to say the least, and the left is in a difficult place because we haven't had the ability to insert ourselves in the imagination the way the fascist right and Trump and those interests have been able to do. We need a new imaginary. We need to unlink our imagination from the Democratic Party, and its interest in Hollywood, for example. Whether it's, Keanu Reeves or Oprah Winfrey or, Jay-Z, they're all like part of this. They're all billionaires and invested in this order that needs to change if we're to save the world at this point. But they're not saying that. You're not going to get that on TV, in movies, or anything else. It's a longer conversation, but it's a beautiful question. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Oh, Andrew has one more question.
Yeah, sorry, just one more. You talked about how at the end of part one, that there was this idea of silence that sort of manifested in future generations of El Salvadorians. I'm just curious, could you elaborate on that and sort of what that meant and what it means now?
Yeah, in addition to amnesia and forgetting, nations need silence. You need to have a population that is docile, that is ignorant, that is bamboozled into submission. That's how you maintain the order. The way that national security types look at this is the last thing they want to do is to put bullets inside of you. They'll do it if they have to. The best way to dominate you is to have you yourself disarm yourself by forgetting, by ignorance, by not caring. And so those are all different forms of silence. And, Salvador now, and increasingly in the United States, terror is a major source of silencing people. And and I try to make a connection between the terror of the state and the terror in some of our families, quite frankly, like mine. My dad beat my ass. My dad humiliated me. He made me the rebel. Now, if you study psychology like I have in my efforts, I'm sure some of you have, to try to, damn, man, why do I feel so crappy sometimes? In my efforts to understand that, I've read people like this guy named R.D. Laing. He's a psychologist, a brilliant psychologist from the 60s and 70s, who wrote a book called The Politics of the Family, The Politics of Experience. And this goes to silence. So he looked at families and silences and things, and he realized that a child's first contact with the state is what?
Would it be like education?
That's a secondary one, good guess, but no, there's one that's before that. Your family. The subconscious of your parents contain a lot of ideology. Your own subconscious, we don't control. We have 10% control of our minds. 90% is subconscious. So the state, national security interests, people like Susan Rice and Samuel Huntington that have advised presidents, they specialize in psychological operations, which is most of what national security is about as a practitioner. So that you want to get the message into people that they're powerless, helpless, and that the order that exists will always exist. There's nothing you can do. It's a waste of time. So if you look at some of our parents are sometimes the first bearers of that message between the lines, underneath levels of awareness. At least in my family, it was funny because my parents were both union members and they were fighters. My mom took me to my first labor union protests when I was like 10 years old, hitting pots and pans in the streets. But at the same time, my mom had that military dictatorship messaging inside of her as well, in her subconscious, as did my father. And there's a silence about it. So that my parents, if you read the book, they didn't want me to get involved in Salvadoran politics or in politics at all. Why? Because of the message of the state. Don't get involved, or they lived in a military dictatorship, or you're going to get slaughtered. So, I mean, the gangs understand this in El Salvador too. They had a phrase that they would use: ver, oír, callar. See, hear, shut up. Right? So different actors use violence and terror to perpetrate the silences that they need to continue exercising powers in the local, regional, national, and global levels that they exercise power in.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great group of students here.
One more question. I would say too, Roberto, as we're waiting for a question, I mean, coming from the Netherlands, a country that has a very good rap in terms of, what used to be, decent leftist politics. I mean, people don't want to know when I go back to Amsterdam and I see my city, and it's a beautiful city, and I say that this city is built on colonialism. That didn't go over very well for a really long time. I mean, there's now finally, different kinds of ways of inserting, people's memories, the colonized themselves within the Netherlands, but that didn't happen. So it's in Europe, and I think the neoliberal agenda, has extended far above outside of the United States. And
yeah, can I say one other thing?
Sure.
Responding to some of the questions, like especially Andrew's. If you're oftentimes people read my book and they say, "Hey man, I'm inspired. I want to go find out the silences in my family." What the fuck did they tell me, man, that I didn't know about? Right? Which is a natural desire for any human that wants to really kind of better themselves by not living a lie. So, but it's hard to get at those silences in your family. They don't come easily. You have to, again, look at long-term. There's a place, if somebody could look it up, called the Dart Center on Trauma. You can put that link in there. They have excellent resources on how to do interviews of people that have been traumatized, including your family members. But if you want to do that work, you got to do it long term, and you kind of have to not do it, avoid conflict at all costs, because that'll make your lose. And do it systematically, piece by piece. Pick off the lowest hanging fruit, the members of your family that are most willing to talk. Gather information, and as you gather your information more and more, eventually you'll land on something that makes it easier for somebody like a parent to come and say, "All right, look, let me talk. All right, you seem to be really interested in this, and you've done your homework. Let me tell you the real story," which is what happened in my case. The other thing, in terms of struggling, your question for, what do we do about struggle? We have to, like in our families, we have to kind of if you're going to do struggle, ideological struggle in your family, I would encourage not conflict. The biggest thing that I've discovered that helped my family understand me and my politics was my example. How you walk and talk in the world. If they saw me joining a guerrilla army because I believed so passionately what I believed, that persuaded some people, because they were like, "Damn, he's not playing." And he stayed in it. And then after the war, I'm still at it, but except the new theater of battle and struggle is memory, is literature, is writing, is culture. I believe we have to change the culture to change the minds that the culture influences. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. I have one, hopefully, I think, but it's because something you brought up already, and it was one of my questions about trauma and healing. And I was actually, you mentioned this, the Dart Center, but was wondering if you're familiar or with the work of Dr. Gabor Mate, who sees trauma as generational and doing trauma work as healing communities intergenerationally as well. And so I think your writing, you say that, you know, this intimate memory and the excavation of memory and the unsilencing is a healing journey, right? And is that where the hope is, or?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I have hope in healing. I didn't write the book to heal, and I wouldn't encourage anybody to write a book to heal, because that'll affect your story, right? My story is my story as I perceived it and I experienced it. That it had cathartic effects to explore and understand my father, the violence of El Salvador, and to process it, absolutely. And because you're a smaller group here, you know, now that I see that, you know, a few people have left, I'll share with you something they're going to miss out on. The backstory of how I wrote this book. The wisest thing I ever did as a writer was to retain a therapist before I embarked on writing this book. That again, it's not just about violence. It's actually more about how to overcome it and how to create sustainable struggle, how to face the abyss of the world you live in. I've been to my own version of Dante's 9-10 circles of hell. And I came out and I didn't blow my brains out. One of the ways I did that was to retain a therapist before I started the book. And on top of that, the gods of healing and decent writing shone favorably upon me to give me a therapist who was not just a former hippie, but a son of a Holocaust survivor. So he came equipped perfectly to deal with my stuff. And if that wasn't enough, he was part of this clandestine network that prescribes the most powerful medicine known for dealing with trauma, depression, alcoholism. Anybody want to guess what that is? I'm in California. There's a hint.
Is it LSD?
You got it. You got it. Psychedelics are the most powerful medicine. You can go to Johns Hopkins, the London School, I forget what it is. You know, all these eminent, here at Berkeley, there are all these research institutes talking about that. So I macrodosed and microdosed my way through my Dante circles of hell. And so absolutely, I think I feel as a social change actor, agent, I feel more dangerous than I've ever felt to a system that's diseased, right? I don't know if you heard of Audre Lorde, the great poet, one of my favorites. Audre Lorde talked about how in a diseased system, one of the most important things you can do is be healthy. And so I've taken that to heart, and I absolutely understand, because if I'm of a clear mind, if I have a clear conscience, my heart is beating well physically and spiritually, I'm gonna make better political decisions that lead to social change. But if I'm diseased, then the disease system will come in and find a place under my skin to get at me with, you know, commodities, with wealth, with power, with sex, with entertainment, with drugs, etc. So, yeah, I think my great hope is in the collective action of individuals organized in an anti-capitalist way, and that a good amount of those individuals would be simultaneously doing the work to have a clear mind and heart so that they don't repeat some of the mistakes that some of my compañeros in the FMLN did. Like if you read my book, I went to a mass gravesite with the Boston Globe to report on this, and I was protected by these police that were FMLN police. They were the police that I fought to help create, supposedly a more just, because the FMLN was in power. The former guerrillas were in power, in 2015 when I went to that mass gravesite. So then I come back to a camp, and suddenly an FMLN lawyer, attorney, like the Attorney General's office, comes and says, hey, you took pictures and video at that gravesite. You have to erase them. And then the police that were protecting me, the FMLN police, surrounded me at gunpoint and forced me to erase the pictures. So those folks who were in, some of whom were in the revolutionary movement with me, were the ones that did that. So I connect that to a lack of vision, a term right word, a susceptibility to power, that if you're not healthy, power will get under your skin. I guarantee it, especially when you're young. That's why do that healthy work, whatever that means to you.
Thanks so much for that. I definitely want to follow up with you, Roberto, about some of the stuff I'm working with. Also, your connection to the mission in Santana.
The
also
murals. San
Yeah.
Francisco has the highest concentration of murals in the world. By the way, if you want to get a hold of me, you can get a hold of me at my website.
Mhm.
And if you like what I said, the best of what I said and more than that is in my book.
I know, and we have, I wanted to know, we will have books available at the History, Anthropology, and Classics department. If those of you want to check out Roberto's book, and, you know, faculty, staff, students, you know, let me know, you know, where to find me. Any last comments? No, thank you so much,
Oh, for
Roberto
me?
Lovato. Yes.
Oh, no, yeah, absolutely. For me, yeah, absolutely. It's been my honor to have your attention for this brief time. This is why I wrote the book, is to have communication with minds and hearts, especially young minds and young hearts. I have more faith in you all than I do in the established powers. And I just incite you to be honest with yourselves and act in accordance with what your heart and your mind say, and you'll live a satisfying life. Because I've lived through some heavy shit, but I have a satisfying, I'm gonna die okay. I'm gonna die, probably die happy, you know, because of the life that I've lived. And I think that's what you want to do. And that's how you want to plan for your futures, not just what your parents tell you about making money, but because of what can make you a happy person in your life in a world that's in epic crisis. So thank you. It's been my honor and privilege.
Yeah, I'm seeing in the chat too a lot of thanks, and I want to express my thanks too for you being here, and also for the opportunity to follow up with you, you know, the students as well. So thank you so much for that.
And thank you to Christopher for holding things up on the tech end.
Yeah, anytime.
Okay.
All right.
Un
Thank you
gusto.
all. Have a good night. Hopefully
All
see
right.
you at other hostile terrain events.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to meet you.